The morning she woke to find the barn already mucked, Rose Dalton did not cry. She had spent every last tear she owned in the 3 months since her husband's burial, and there was simply nothing left inside her chest that could fall. She lay still for a long moment in the gray pre-dawn light, listening to the wind push against the cabin walls, and she knew. She knew the way a woman knows things that cannot be explained by daylight logic, the way the skin on the back of your neck knows when someone is watching you from across a crowded room. She knew who had done it, and knowing it cracked something open inside her that she had been fighting to keep sealed shut. Louis Keating. She pressed her face into the rough pillow and said nothing to no one. Outside, the rooster had not even begun his noise yet. The world was still dark and cold, and the kind of quiet that sits on the high plains of southeastern Colorado in early April of 1878 like a held breath. She should have felt relief. The barn chores were done, which meant she would not be late hauling water to the garden, which meant the seedlings she had started in tin cans on the windowsill might actually survive long enough to be transplanted, which meant she might eat through next winter without begging from neighbors. She should have felt nothing but practical, exhausted gratitude. Instead, she felt terrified. Because Louis Keating doing something kind for her without being asked, without announcing it, without expecting a single word of thanks, meant that the wall she had spent 3 months building between herself and the rest of the world had a crack in it. And cracks, in her experience, had a way of becoming canyons. She threw the blanket back and put her feet on the cold plank floor. She dressed in the dark the way she had learned to do everything, alone, without ceremony, without anyone watching. She laced her boots without sitting down because sitting down to lace boots was a luxury that belonged to women with husbands, and she was not that woman anymore. She was Rose Dalton, 26 years old, widow of Thomas Dalton, who had been dead since January, owner of 40 acres of difficult land on the eastern edge of the wet mountains, and she was not interested in gratitude or complications or Louis Keating. She told herself that on the walk to the barn. She told herself that while she stood in the open barn door and breathed in the impossible cleanness of it, the fresh straw laid down neat as a church floor, the stalls raked and the water troughs filled and the horses calm and already fed. She told herself that while her hands balled into fists at her sides, and her throat did something complicated, and her eyes did the thing she had sworn they would not do, she turned around and walked back to the cabin and started the fire and put the coffee on, and refused to think about Louis Keating for the rest of the morning. She lasted until about 8:30. But to understand why that was so impossible, and why Louis Keating mucking a barn before dawn was the kind of act that could unmake a woman who had survived burying her husband in frozen ground, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back 4 months, to the worst afternoon of Rose Dalton's life, which was saying something, because she had lived through several serious contenders for that title. It was December of 1877, and the sky over the eastern Colorado territory had gone the color of dirty pewter 3 days before Christmas, and the wind coming down off the mountains had teeth in it that could strip skin. Rose had been in the kitchen of the small cabin she and Thomas had built themselves over 2 summers, running her hands over the old quilt her mother had sent from Kentucky, because the cold had been inside her for weeks in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Thomas had not been himself since the fall. The cough that had started in September had done what bad coughs did in thin, high-altitude air on men who were not as strong as they pretended. It had deepened and settled and spread, and by December it was not a cough anymore. It was an announcement. She had known he was going to die approximately 6 weeks before he did. She had not told him she knew, because Thomas Dalton was a proud man from a proud Virginia family who had come west to rebuild the pride his father had lost in the war, and he would not have appreciated anyone, least of all his wife, mapping the trajectory of his mortality with such clear-eyed accuracy. So she had cared for him and kept quiet and made plans in the back of her mind, the way women learned to do when there was no one else to make them. He died on a Tuesday in January, which felt wrong. Deaths in stories happened at dramatic moments, in storms or at sunsets or during significant speeches. Thomas had died on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning while she was in the next room washing dishes, and she had not even heard it happen. She had gone in to check on him, and he was simply gone. His face finally relaxed in a way she had not seen in months, and she had stood there with her wet hands dripping on the floor for a long time before she did anything else. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles east. That was the Keating place. She had not wanted to go there. She had not wanted to go anywhere. She had wanted to sit down on the floor of her cabin and pull the darkness over herself like a blanket and disappear. But there were practical matters. There was a body that needed to be seen to before the cold gave way, and there were official notifications that had to be made, and there was no one else within reasonable distance who could help with either. Louis Keating had come to the territory from Missouri about 3 years before the Daltons arrived, which put him at the Keating homestead for going on 5 years. He was 31 years old, though he looked older in the way that outdoor men did, weathered around the eyes and mouth, with a face that had clearly made its peace with sun and wind and cold, and come out the other side with something that was not quite handsomeness, but was considerably more interesting. He was a quiet man, not the sullen kind of quiet, not the dangerous kind, but the kind that made you aware of how much noise most people made for no reason. He had been at the Dalton place twice before in all the years they were neighbors. Once to help Thomas repair a section of fence that had come down in a summer storm, and once to return a strayed horse. Both times he had spoken when spoken to, refused coffee, done what needed doing, and left. Rose had formed no strong opinion of him either way, which was itself somewhat unusual, because Rose had strong opinions about almost everything and everybody. The morning she walked the 2 miles to the Keating place in the thin January cold to tell him her husband was dead, she was wearing Thomas's coat over her own because the cold was absolute and her wool wrap was not equal to it. She knocked on the door of the Keating cabin, which was larger than hers but built with the same rough practicality, and when Louis opened it and saw her face, he did not ask questions. He simply put on his own coat, told his hired hand Emmett Burgess where he was going, and walked back with her to the Dalton place without a word the entire way. He did what needed to be done. He sent Emmett to the town of Lavetta, which was the nearest place with any official standing, to notify the county authorities and find out about burial arrangements. He helped Rose move Thomas without her having to ask. He sat in the kitchen while she made coffee because he could see that having something to do with her hands was the only thing keeping her upright, and he drank the coffee when she set it in front of him, even though it was too strong and too hot. He did not say he was sorry for her loss, which was what everyone said and which meant nothing. He said, Thomas was a man who worked hard for what he wanted. That counts. And then he was quiet again, and somehow the quiet was better than anything else anyone could have offered. He came back twice that week, once with Emmett and another man from further up the valley to help with the burial, because the ground was frozen and it took 3 men most of an afternoon. And once alone, 2 days after, with a smoked ham from his larder and a sack of cornmeal that she absolutely had not asked for, which he left on the step without knocking, and which she found when she went out to feed the horses. She had stood on the step in the cold, holding the ham and the sack of cornmeal, and the feeling that moved through her was so complex and unwanted that she had gone back inside immediately and put them in the pantry and made herself not think about who had left them. She did not see him again until February, when she rode into Lavetta for supplies, and she passed him on the main street. He touched the brim of his hat. She nodded. They did not stop. She told herself this was exactly right. She was a widow of 3 weeks, and she had a farm to run, and she did not need anything from Louis Keating or anyone else. The problem with that plan was that running a 40-acre farm alone was something that quickly exposed the difference between what a person needed and what a person could actually manage. Thomas had not been a large or particularly strong man, but there had been two of them, and the arithmetic of two was vastly different from the arithmetic of one when it came to hauling, planting, repairing, and generally preventing the entropy that the land was always pushing toward. By the middle of March, Rose had already had to let one fence section go because she could not fix it and do everything else, and she had lost 2 days to a sick horse that had turned out to be nothing serious but had terrified her completely. She was not afraid of hard work. She had never been afraid of it. She was afraid of the specific kind of exhaustion that came from doing hard work alone, the kind that sat behind your eyes at the end of the day and whispered that it was going to be like this forever, and that forever was a very long time. She had just begun to allow herself to think about what options existed for a woman in her situation, in the spring of 1878, in a territory that had been a state for 2 years and still felt like the edge of the world, when she woke to find the barn already mucked. She lasted until 8:30, and then she put on her coat and her hat and walked to the Keating place. The morning was cold but clear, the kind of April morning in the high country that made promises it would not keep after noon, and she walked the 2 miles between the properties at a pace that was faster than was comfortable because she had made a decision, and she intended to carry it out before doubt could catch up with her. She could see the Keating barn from the hill before she descended into the slight valley where his cabin sat, and she could see Louis in the yard splitting wood with the economical precision of a man who had been splitting wood for a long time and had stopped wasting energy on extra motion. He saw her coming. She knew he did because he stopped working and set the axe handle against the chopping block and waited, which was somehow more discomforting than if he had kept splitting and pretended to notice her only when she was close. He was waiting for her with his full attention, which was a thing most people did not do. She stopped about 6 feet from him. She looked at him. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and his hair was doing what it always did, which was sit in such a way that suggested it had once had a plan and abandoned it. He was watching her with those light gray eyes that she had already privately decided were the most unsettling feature of a face that was generally unsettling for reasons she refused to examine. "You did my barn," she said. It was not an accusation. It was not a thank you either. It was something more complicated than both. "Yes," Louis said. He did not offer explanation or apology. "I did not ask you to do my barn. No. I need you to understand that I am perfectly capable of doing my own barn." "I know you are," Louis said. And the thing about it was that he clearly did know and meant it, and was not offering the words as comfort or as flattery. He was stating a fact in the same tone he would use to say that the sky was clear or that the wood was dry. Rose looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them. A magpie called from somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek to the east. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not the hesitating kind of quiet, the considering kind. "Because I was up early and it wanted doing and you have enough on you," he said. She wanted to be angry about that. She had prepared herself on the walk over to be angry about it, to tell him that she did not need his pity, that she was managing, that she had always managed and always would. But standing in front of him in the thin April sunlight with the smell of wood chips around them and the horses in his corral moving quietly behind the fence, the anger would not come. What came instead was something worse, something far more difficult to address. "I am not asking for help," she said. "I know. I need you to hear that clearly." "I hear it," Louis said. He picked up the axe handle and turned it over in his hands, not using it, just holding it. "I am not offering help. I got up at 4 in the morning because I could not sleep, and I walked out to clear my head, and your barn was on the way and it needed doing. That is all. Your property is 2 miles from mine. My barn is not on the way to anywhere from your house." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, but the suggestion that a smile existed somewhere in the general vicinity. "No," he agreed. "I suppose it is not." And there it was. the admission in one word that undid the whole careful fiction of accidental helpfulness and left them standing in the morning air with nothing between them but the truth of what it meant that a man had walked 2 miles in the dark to muck a widow's barn. Rose looked at the ground, then she looked back up at him. "I have coffee on," she said, "if you want to come and have some when you are done here." "All right," Louis said. She walked back to the cabin and put more wood on the fire and got out the good cups, which she had not used since Thomas was alive. And then she stood at the window and watched the ridge line and told herself that this was a practical matter, a neighborly exchange, a cup of coffee between 2 adults in a territory where community mattered because survival mattered, and that it had absolutely nothing to do with the way Louis Keating's voice landed in her chest like something solid and warm. He came at 11, after she had done the morning work and he presumably had done his. He knocked, which Thomas never did because it was his house and you did not knock at your own house, and she opened the door and he took his hat off when he came inside, which Thomas had also not done, and she was suddenly very aware of both things at once. The cabin was small and he was not a small man, not in height or in the kind of presence that certain people carried around with them like weather. He sat at the kitchen table and she set coffee in front of him and she sat down across from him, and they were quiet for a moment in the way that they had been quiet together before, and she noticed that the quiet did not feel empty. It felt inhabited. "Your horses look good," he said. "Both of them. Bessie had a scare in March. I thought it was colic, but it passed. Glad it passed. I was not sure what I would have done if it had not," she said, and then stopped because she had not meant to say that. She had not meant to let anything out that suggested a gap in her management of her situation. Louis did not lean forward with sympathy or offer solutions. He nodded. "Colic is bad to handle alone," he said, "but you handled it." "I did," Rose said. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside the window, the April wind was picking up and pushing clouds from the west, the kind that sometimes meant afternoon snow at this elevation, and sometimes just meant gray skies and a cold mood. "I have been thinking about the east fence," she said, because it was the thing she had been most worried about, and saying it out loud to another person felt like setting down a rock she had been carrying. "The section by the creek. It came down in February, and I cannot get it back up the way it needs to be alone. I have been patching it with rope. I could come look at it," Louis said. "I would pay you for your time." The quiet that followed that statement was a different quality from the ones before it. She looked at him and found him looking at her with an expression she could not quite classify. "No," he said. "Louis." She said his name without meaning to and then had to keep going as if she had meant to. "Louis, I will not be beholden. I am not that kind of woman." "I know you are not," he said. And then slowly, as if he were choosing each word with care, "I am not offering charity. I am offering a fence repair." They are different things. The difference being what exactly? He looked down at his coffee and then back up at her. "The difference is what is behind it," he said. The room was very quiet. The wind pushed against the window glass. Rose felt her heart do something complicated in her chest that she categorically refused to acknowledge in any way. "What is behind it?" she asked. The question came out softer than she had intended. Louis Keating, who was not a man who said things he did not mean and never had been, looked at her for a moment in the morning light of her kitchen. "I am working up to telling you that," he said. "I would appreciate a little more time." She did not know what to do with that, so she refilled his coffee, and they talked about the east fence and the condition of the south pasture, and whether the spring planting would go well this year. And he drank 2 cups and then stood and put his hat back on and said he would come on Saturday to look at the fence. She said that would be fine. After he left, she stood at the door and watched him walk back up the road, and she pressed her hand against her sternum where the complicated thing was happening, and she said out loud to the empty room, "You are being extremely foolish, Rose Dalton." The room did not argue. He came on Saturday as promised, and Emmett Burgess came with him because 3 fence posts needed replacing, and that required a post hole digger and 2 sets of hands to hold things steady while others were set. They worked for most of the morning, and Rose brought them water, and at midday brought out cornbread and cold beans, which she had prepared with more care than she admitted to herself. And they ate at the outdoor table Thomas had built and never quite finished, the one with one leg slightly shorter than the others that made it rock if you leaned on it wrong. Emmett was a decent man of 40-something years, sun-dark and talkative in the comfortable way of men who spent most of their time in near silence, and valued the occasions when they did not have to. He told her about his daughter in Pueblo who had just married a railroad man, and about a horse he had traded for that had turned out better than expected, and about his theory that the coming summer would be dry based on the behavior of the creek in March. Louis let Emmett talk and worked, which Rose had already figured out was his natural mode. He spoke when he had something to say and did not speak when he did not, and the effect was that when he did say something, she found herself listening in a way she did not with Emmett, who was perfectly pleasant but whose words slid through her attention like water. When Emmett went to refill the water bucket from the well, Louis looked at her from across the table. "Fence is solid now," he said. "Should last you through the season. Thank you, both of you. Emmett likes coming over. He does not get enough people to talk at." She almost smiled. "Is that why you brought him?" Louis considered. "Partly. Also, he is the only one who can use the post-hole digger for more than 20 minutes without wearing out. And partly," he looked at her steadily, "because I thought you might be more comfortable with someone else here the first time." The first time. She noticed the choice of words. "The first time," she repeated. "If there is a second time," he said, "which is up to you." And there it was again, that quality of restraint in him that was not coldness but something more like deliberate patience, the sense that he had a destination in mind, but was entirely willing to let her set the pace of the journey. It undid her more thoroughly than any declaration could have, because she was a woman who had been managed and arranged and planned around by well-meaning people her whole life, beginning with her father in Kentucky and continuing with Thomas, who had been a good man but had made most of his decisions unilaterally, and assumed she would adjust. And here was Louis Keating telling her that the second time was up to her. She said, "I suppose the garden beds could use turning before planting." "I expect they could," Louis said, "if you were interested in helping with that, which I would pay for." "No," he said with the same calm certainty as before. "Then what do you want for it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me something true, something you have not told anyone." She stared at him. "That is an unusual price for garden labor." "Yes," he agreed. She thought about it while Emmett came back with the water bucket and picked up the thread of his railroad daughter story, and they sat in the thin afternoon sun. She thought about it for 3 days after, while she did the daily work of keeping the farm from falling apart around her. And she thought about it while she lay in bed at night in the place where Thomas had been and was not anymore. And she turned it over in her mind the way you turned a coin to see both sides. When Louis came back the following Wednesday with his own spade and rake, she was already in the garden with hers, and they worked side by side for an hour before she said anything that was not about soil or depth or the proper distance between seed rows. "I'm afraid," she said. It came out between one breath and the next while she was bent over a row, and she straightened up and looked at him without planning to. He stopped raking. He looked at her. "Of what?" he asked. "Of doing this alone for 20 more years. Of the fence and the barn and the horses and the garden and the winter, and doing it all alone every year until I am old or until I give up and go back to Kentucky, which I will not do because I have put everything I have into this land and leaving it would be losing twice." She stopped. She had not planned to say any of that. "That is the true thing." Louis was very still. The wind moved through the garden, ruffling the edge of her skirt and the brim of her hat and doing nothing to him that she could see, as if it simply worked around him. "You are not going to do it alone," he said. "You do not know that." "Yes," he said, "I do." She looked at him for a long moment, and the afternoon sun was in her eyes, and she had her hands on a rake handle and dirt on her boots, and she felt something shift in her, the way a stone shifts at the bottom of a river, quiet and irreversible. "Who are you, Louis Keating?" she said. The question was not entirely literal, and he seemed to know that, because the answer he gave was not entirely literal either. "Someone who has been waiting a considerable amount of time to be useful to the right person," he said. She turned back to the garden and they worked until the light went. And when they were done, she asked him to stay for supper. And he did. And they ate beans and biscuits by the firelight, and she asked him about Missouri and he told her. And she told him about Kentucky. And by the time he left it was past 8 o'clock, and the stars over the Colorado high country were extraordinary. And she stood at the door and watched his lantern bob down the road and found that she was considerably less afraid than she had been that morning. There were things she did not know about him yet, things that would matter. She learned the first of them in May, when she rode into La Veta for supplies and was waiting outside the general store for her order to be packed when Harlan Booth, who ran the La Veta Star and considered himself the unofficial historian and social conscience of the territory, stopped beside her on the boardwalk and said, with the particular pleasure that small-town gossips took in delivering information they knew would land hard, "I see Louis Keating has been spending time at your property, Mrs. Dalton." She said evenly, "He has been helping with some repairs, as a neighbor." "Is that what it is?" Harlan Booth said, in the tone that made clear he did not believe that was what it was. "You know about his situation, of course." She looked at him. She knew that to say she did not know would be to give him the satisfaction of telling her, but she could not pretend ignorance she was certain she was actually experiencing. "I know what he has chosen to tell me," she said. Harlan Booth looked at her with the expression of a man who was about to do her a great favor whether she wanted it or not. "He was married," he said, "before he came here, back in Missouri. His wife left him. Just packed and left is what people said. Took nothing with her which you might find interesting. Left the note and was gone." Rose kept her face very still. "That is his private history." "Well," Harlan Booth said, clearly disappointed by her reaction, "I just thought you ought to know what you were getting into. A man whose wife left him without explanation has usually given her one." She thanked him with minimum courtesy and went into the store and collected her supplies and rode home. But the information sat in her mind, not like poison, not like a warning, but like a question she intended to ask. She asked it on a Thursday in late May, when Louis had come to help her with the seedling transplants that had finally grown large enough to go into the garden beds. They were kneeling in the dirt side by side, and she had been thinking about how to say it for 3 days, and finally she just said it. "Were you married before?" He did not tense. He did not look guilty or defensive. He set a tomato seedling into the hole he had dug, pressed the earth around it, and looked at her. "Yes," he said. "What happened?" "Her name was Clara," he said. "We married young. I was 22, and she was 19. And we thought love was enough on its own without the kind of daily choosing that it actually takes. I was a difficult man to live with in those years, ambitious in a way that had no room for anyone else's needs inside it. She was not happy and she told me so, and I did not listen adequately, and eventually she left." He was quiet for a moment. "I cannot say she was wrong to go." Rose looked at him. "Where is she now?" "She married again, a businessman in St. Louis. I heard from someone who knows someone that she has 2 children and appears content." "Are you sorry?" "About the way I was?" "Yes, considerably." He picked up another seedling. "About where I ended up?" "No. If I had been different I would not have come here, and if I had not come here—" He stopped. "You would not have mucked my barn," she said. The corner of his mouth did the thing again. "No, I would not have." She thought about that. She thought about how a man's worst chapter could be the road to his best one. She thought about Thomas, who had been kind but not present in the way she had needed, who had loved her in his way but whose way had left her lonelier inside their marriage than she had expected to feel. She thought about how she had mourned him honestly, but had also, in the darkest corner of her heart that she would never speak about to anyone, felt something complicated about the nature of what she was mourning. "I am not afraid of your past," she said. "I want you to know that." He set down the seedling and turned to look at her, and the afternoon sun was doing something remarkable to the color of his eyes, making them less gray and more the color of spring water over stones. "Rose," he said, just her name. No one had said her name that way since she was very small, and her mother used to say it calling her in from the fields, with the full weight of a specific person's value inside it. "Yes," she said. "I am going to tell you something that I should have said before now." "All right." He turned fully toward her, kneeling in the garden dirt, with his hands still dark with soil. "I have been in love with you since last November," he said. The world went very quiet. The wind in the cottonwoods, the horses in the pasture, the distant call of a meadowlark, all of it receded to a great distance. "That was before Thomas died," she said. "Yes. You were in love with a married woman." "Yes." His voice was steady, carrying no apology but also no false confidence. "I did nothing about it. I would never have done anything about it. I am not telling you to excuse myself. I am telling you because you asked me once what was behind the fence repair and the cornbread visits and the barn, and the honest answer is this. You asked for truth, so here it is." She sat back on her heels in the garden dirt and looked at him, and inside her, a war was happening. Because part of her heard the word betrayal, heard the word forbidden, heard the suggestion of a dark and hidden thing that should disqualify him entirely from her trust or her heart. And part of her looked at a man who had known a feeling and had kept it absolutely private and had done nothing with it except be a good neighbor, who had not moved toward her after Thomas died until she moved toward him, who had walked 2 miles in the dark to muck a barn not to press his advantage but simply because he could not sleep and her farm needed it. "How long have you been coming over here feeling the way you feel?" she asked. "Since January," he said. "When you walked to my door in Thomas's coat in the cold. And you have not tried, no," he said simply. "You were grieving. I was not going to put anything on you that you were not ready to carry." She looked at her hands, still holding a seedling, its pale roots dangling. "I do not know what I am ready for," she said. "I know," Louis said. "There is no hurry. There is no hidden motive here, Rose. I am not trying to get your land or your labor or your company for my convenience. I am asking for nothing from you. I am simply telling you the truth that you asked me for weeks ago, and I will go on coming to help with the garden and the fence and whatever else needs doing. And if you decide at any point that you want nothing more from me than that, I will respect it without complaint." She looked at him for a long time. "You are a very strange man," she said finally. "I have been told," he agreed. She turned back to the seedlings. They planted in silence for a while, and the afternoon was warm and the earth was dark and fragrant. And when their hands reached for the same seedling at the same moment and touched, neither of them pulled back immediately. They stayed like that for one breathless second, knuckles against knuckles in the dirt, and then she said quietly, "I need more time." "Take all you need," he said. She needed 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, they saw each other 8 times, which worked out to a little more than once a week, and each time something shifted incrementally, like the hands of a clock that you never see move but that have clearly moved when you look again. He came to help with the garden. She went to his place once when he mentioned his stove had developed a leak in the stovepipe that he could not reach at the angle required, and she was smaller and more agile on a ladder than he was, and they discovered a mutual facility for working together that felt startlingly natural. She handed him things and he fitted them, and she told him when the angle was wrong and he adjusted without argument, and it was done in under an hour, and they had coffee after, sitting on his porch in the late afternoon with the mountains west of them going gold. "I went into La Veta yesterday," she said. "Did you need anything?" "I needed fabric for a new skirt." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Harlan Booth says people are talking." Louis looked at the mountains. "What do they say?" "Nothing specific, the usual kind of talking, speculative." "Does that bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "Less than I expected it to," she said. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that she was beginning to understand was how Louis Keating showed feelings he was not going to say out loud, a kind of luminous attention, a focusing of the full force of him. "I am glad," he said. "I think," she started and then stopped, and then made herself continue. I think I would like you to stop saying you want nothing from me, because it is not quite true anymore, is it?" The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. "No," Louis said, "it is not." "Then stop saying it. Say what is true instead." He set his cup down on the porch railing and turned to face her, and the late afternoon sun was behind him now, and he said, "I want to know you for the rest of my life. I want to come to your place and go home from it and come back again and do that indefinitely. I want to eat at your table and I want to fix your fence and I want to sit in the quiet with you without either of us having to fill it. I want—" He stopped. Then, more quietly, "I want to be the person you are not afraid to need." Rose felt the crack in the wall that she had noticed the morning she found the clean barn. She felt it open wider. "Louis," she said, "yes, I am going to need you to kiss me before I lose my nerve." He stood from his chair and crossed the porch to where she was sitting, and he took her face in his hands, which were rough and warm and enormous against her face, and he kissed her very gently and then less gently, and the mountains turned to deep gold and then orange and then purple behind them, and when they separated, she was gripping the front of his shirt with both hands and he was looking at her as if she were the most important thing he had ever seen. "Rose Dalton," he said. "Yes. I intend to court you properly," she laughed. It surprised her. She had not laughed, a real full laugh, since before Thomas got sick, and the sound of it was strange and wonderful to her own ears. "Then court me properly," she said. He did. The summer of 1878 in the Territory was everything Emmett Burgess's Creek theory had suggested it would be: hot and dry. The kind of summer that turned the grass to tinder by August and made water the most important subject of conversation in any gathering of farming people. Louis had a better well than Rose, dug deeper by the previous owner of his property, and he extended its use to her without discussion, which she accepted because she had made her peace with accepting things from him. There was a difference, she had come to understand, between accepting charity and accepting care. The difference was indeed in what was behind it. He came to her table every Sunday. He sent word if he was going to be late. He brought things, not grand things. A book from the lending library that the school teacher in Lavetta ran, a particular kind of peppermint candy that she had mentioned once being fond of, a cutting from a rose bush that he had dug up from the abandoned homestead north of his property because he had thought she might want it. He remembered everything she said. Every passing comment, every mention of preference or memory or small desire was apparently stored in him and brought out later in small acts of specific attention. She fell in love with him. The way she suspected was the only real way to fall in love, not in a moment but in accumulation, the way rivers were made by rain. She could not point to the exact day it became love rather than attraction or need or gratitude. She knew by mid-July that it had already happened when she went 3 days without seeing him due to a problem with his cattle that required his full attention, and found that the 3 days had a quality of diminishment, a grayness, that had nothing to do with the weather, which was brilliant, and everything to do with his absence. She rode to his place on the 4th day under the pretense of returning the book she had finished, and when he came out of the barn and saw her, the way his face changed, the quiet explosion of some carefully contained brightness, she had to look away because it was almost too much to look at directly. "You finished the book," he said. 2 days ago," she admitted. "You did not need to return it today specifically." "No," she agreed. He looked at her. She looked at him. The summer sun was absolute and still. "Come inside," he said. "I have lemonade." She handed the book down from the horse and he took it, and their hands held it together for a moment, and then he said quietly, not looking at her, "I missed you." "I know," she said. "I missed you too." The courtship had a shape that felt both old-fashioned and right to her, the shape of 2 adults who had each lived enough to know what they wanted and were choosing carefully. He did not rush her. She did not rush herself. But by August the question was not whether but when, and they were both aware of it, and the awareness created a kind of sweet, unbearable tension between them that made the Sunday suppers and the Wednesday garden sessions and the Saturday fence repairs feel lit from inside. It was Emmett Burgess, of all people, who named it. He had come over to help Louis clear a drainage ditch in late August, and Rose had been there helping, because she had by this point given up pretending that her interest in Louis's property began and ended with anything practical, and they had all three had supper afterward at Louis's table, and Emmett had looked back and forth between them twice and said, "You two are going to get married." Rose looked at her beans. Louis looked at Emmett. "That is between the lady and me," Louis said. "Sure it is," Emmett said. "And if you ask her soon enough, she is going to say yes." Rose kept her eyes on her beans. But the corner of her mouth did the thing that Louis usually did, the thing that was the relative of a smile, and from across the table she felt Louis see it. He asked her on a Saturday evening in early September, when the summer heat had finally broken, and the high country evenings had gone cool and sharp again, and the aspens on the hillsides above his cabin had started the first yellow blush that would deepen to gold. They were sitting on her porch after supper, and the stars were beginning to appear over the eastern horizon, and she was thinking about nothing in particular, just sitting in the comfortable, inhabitable quiet that was one of her favorite things about being with him. He said, "Rose," she said, "Louis," he said, "marry me." It was not a question exactly. It was not a demand either. It was the kind of statement that left all the space in the world for her response but was also perfectly clear about where he stood. She thought about it for possibly 3 seconds. "Yes," she said. He let out a long breath, as if he had been holding it for a considerable time, possibly since January, and he reached over and took her hand, and they sat there in the cooling September evening watching the stars come out one by one, and she felt, for the first time since she could clearly remember, that the future was something she wanted to walk toward. They were married in October, by the circuit preacher who came through La Veta 4 times a year, in the La Veta Methodist Church, which seated about 60 people, and on that day held 83 because the news of Rose Dalton and Louis Keating had apparently been of considerable interest to the surrounding territory. Emmett Burgess was best man and cried, which he denied afterward. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Margaret Farris, who had become the closest thing Rose had to a friend in the territory, stood with her. Rose wore the blue silk dress she had made herself, which was not traditional white, but was exactly the color of the morning sky at the moment before the sun came fully over the horizon, and Louis wore a suit that fit him considerably better than any other suit she had ever seen him adjacent to. And when they faced each other at the front of the small church, he looked at her with the focused entirety of his attention, and she looked back, and the preacher said his words, and they said theirs. Harlan Booth was there, because Harlan Booth was everywhere, and he wrote a small notice for the La Veta Star that referred to it as a union of neighboring farmers who had found common cause, which was the most understated description of anything that Rose had ever encountered. She laughed about it privately with Louis for years afterward. They moved into the Dalton cabin rather than the Keating place, because the Dalton cabin was smaller and easier to heat, and they both agreed that the land Rose had claimed was better for the particular kind of farming they planned. Louis sold his property to a family from Ohio who arrived in the territory in early 1879 with too many children and a look of determined optimism that reminded Rose painfully of herself and Thomas, arriving 4 years prior. She hoped the Ohio family would do better than Thomas had. Emmett Burgess stayed on with them as a hired hand, continuing in the role he had always occupied but now officially and with regular wages, which he claimed to not care about and clearly did care about because he kept the money in a tin box and added to it with visible satisfaction. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was hard, the way winters in the wet mountains were hard, with weeks of cold that locked the world into silence and ice. But it was different from the winter before, which had been the worst winter of Rose's life. It was different because there were 2 of them, and the arithmetic of 2, as she had always known, was vastly better than the arithmetic of 1. They worked together with the same wordless facility they had discovered in the garden and on Louis' stovepipe, she knowing his next move and him knowing hers, a choreography that had developed through months of practice and that felt, in the cold dark of winter, like the most luxurious thing she had ever possessed. There was joy in that winter. She had not expected to feel so much of it. She had expected comfort, stability, the practical warmth of a shared life. She had not expected to find that Louis Keating, who was a quiet man in public, was in private full of small, unexpected moments. The way he told stories about Missouri that made her laugh in the dark. The way he could not let a wrong thing stand without addressing it, even when addressing it was inconvenient. The way he looked at her in the morning when she was not yet fully awake, as if what he saw was exactly what he had been looking for. She had not expected to feel, at 26 years old, in a small cabin in the Colorado high country, that she was somehow in possession of everything. In March of 1879, she told him she was pregnant. He was out at the woodpile and she went to the door and called him, and when he came inside, she said it without preamble because she had never been a woman who circled around things. He went very still in the way that he went still, the absolute focus of him. "You are certain," he said. "I am certain." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her in his arms in a way that was different from the usual way, tighter and more specific, as if he were protecting something that was both in her and in some essential sense also him. "Are you well?" he asked against her hair. "You feel well?" "I feel entirely well," she said. "A little sick in the mornings, but that is apparently normal. We should get the doctor from La Veta. We should eventually get the doctor from La Veta, not today. I want to keep this to ourselves for a little while." He pulled back enough to look at her face. His own face was doing something complicated, some high-pressure internal event that showed only around the edges. "All right," he said, "for a little while." He was careful with her in a way that would have irritated her if it had been the condescending kind of careful. It was not. It was the kind of careful that came from someone paying very close attention and making small adjustments in response to what they actually observed, not what they assumed. He took over the heaviest of the barn work without comment. He made sure there was always hot water available. He learned to make a tea from dried ginger root that helped with the morning sickness, which he had apparently researched by talking to Mrs. Anders at the La Veta pharmacy, with a level of earnest inquiry that Mrs. Anders later told Rose she had found extremely touching. Their son was born in November of 1879, on a cold, clear night that had the stars out in exceptional number, delivered by the La Veta doctor with Emmett pacing outside and Louis inside, who had refused to be paced outside, and whom the doctor had ultimately allowed to stay because his calm was more useful than most men's presence in such situations. They named him James after Louis's father, with Thomas as a middle name, which was Rose's decision, and which Louis had said nothing about except, quietly, that it was right. James Keating was a broad-shouldered, dark-eyed baby who spent the first 3 months of his life apparently outraged by the inconvenience of being in the world and communicating this outrage clearly and at volume. He was the most beautiful thing Rose had ever seen. She thought this at 3 in the morning when she had been awake for 5 hours, and her body ached in every configuration. She thought it with such clarity and conviction that she told Louis so at 3 in the morning 5 hours into it, and he looked at the baby and then at her and said, "Yes, he is." They were, in those first months of James's life, more tired than Rose had known people could be while still technically functioning, and they were also, improbably, happier than she had been at any previous point in her memory. She puzzled over this sometimes in the quiet spaces. "How is it possible," she said one evening in February, with James asleep on her chest and Louis reading by the fire, "to be this exhausted and this happy at the same time?" Louis looked up from his book. "I think," he said, "they are not actually opposites. I think what you are tired from is what is making you happy." She thought about that. She thought he was right. James grew into the kind of small boy who investigated everything with a thoroughness that was sometimes alarming and always interesting. By the time he was 2, he had a comprehensive understanding of the barn that exceeded several adults, and a strong relationship with the horses, which he had apparently decided were his particular responsibility. Louis discovered one morning that James had somehow let himself into the stall of the older mare, Bessie, and was sitting next to her feet talking to her in the serious, murmuring way he talked to things he was explaining. Louis had stood in the barn door for a moment, watching, and then come inside and told Rose, and his face had been doing the complicated internal thing. "He is going to be all right," Louis said. "He is going to be remarkable," Rose said. "Yes," Louis agreed, without a trace of self-consciousness. The farm grew in the years that followed. They broke new ground in the spring of 1880 and planted a wheat field in the east pasture where the soil was deep and good. And the harvest that first year was enough to sell some at the La Veta grain merchant, which was the first time Rose had sold anything at profit since before Thomas died. She stood at the counter while the merchant tallied the weight and wrote the amount in the ledger, and the feeling in her chest was not simple satisfaction, but something more like vindication. This land, which had been too much for her alone, was becoming exactly what she had believed it could be when she and Thomas first walked it 4 years ago. Louis had expanded the cattle operation in a practical, patient way, building the herd year by year from a dozen to 30 to eventually 60 head, keeping careful records in the ledger book he maintained with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything. He had a natural understanding of cattle that was not merely experience but something closer to empathy, a reading of their condition and needs that Emmett, who had worked with cattle his whole life, said was the most natural he had seen. The summer of 1881 brought something unexpected. A homesteading family named the Carvers arrived in the valley, claiming land on the north edge of the Keating property's former boundaries, and brought with them 2 things that mattered to the community: a teenage son who was old enough to help with heavy labor and who became a valuable occasional hand for several properties including theirs, and a dispute about water rights that threatened to become serious. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Rose and Louis's property was the water source for 3 families, and the Carver patriarch, a large and combative man named Silas Carver, had the notion that his upstream position entitled him to divert more than was equitable. The dispute had the potential to become the kind that defined territories and ruined neighbors, the kind where the hidden motive beneath water was really land, and beneath land was really power. Louis handled it with a patience and a directness that Rose watched with something that was both pride and educational. He went to Silas Carver without anger and laid out the water rights as established by territorial law, which he had looked up at the county recorder in Walsenburg, and he did it in a way that left Carver his dignity while making the situation absolutely clear. He also suggested that between the 3 families sharing the creek, a cooperative irrigation schedule would benefit everyone more than any single party taking what they felt entitled to. He had drawn up the proposal himself, with diagrams. Silas Carver agreed after some resistance because the proposal was genuinely reasonable and because Louis was the kind of man who was very difficult to argue with on practical grounds. The water schedule became, over the following years, a model that several other valley families adopted. Rose told him one evening after the Carver business was settled that she thought he had a talent for resolving conflicts. "It is not a talent," he said. "It is just patience and the willingness to look at a problem from where the other person is standing. Most people do not bother with the second part. Most people are too busy being right," he said. She looked at him across the table where James was asleep in the chair he had been outgrowing for months, and that they had not yet replaced because he looked so young in it still. "I am very glad you mucked my barn," she said. Louis looked at her with the full force of his attention, the way he had since the first morning in her kitchen. "So am I," he said. In the spring of 1882, their daughter arrived. She was smaller than James had been but considerably louder from the first breath, and she had Louis's gray eyes and Rose's red-brown hair. And James, who was 2.5 and had been prepared for the arrival with as much information as a 2.5-year-old could reasonably hold, spent the first hour after her birth standing next to the bed where Rose lay, staring at the baby with an expression of serious evaluation. "What do you think of her?" Louis asked him. James considered for a moment. "She is small," he said. She will grow. Does she know about horses?" "Not yet," Louis said. "Perhaps you can teach her." James appeared to find this acceptable. He nodded with the gravity of a boy taking on a significant responsibility. They named her Alina, which had been Louis's mother's name and which Rose had suggested without Louis asking, because she had noticed months ago that he sometimes looked at a locket he kept in his coat pocket, and that he was more careful on his parents' anniversary, which she had memorized from a passing mention. And she understood that grief had many shapes, and that honoring the specific shape of his was the kind of love that went beyond the easy declarations. When she told him the name she had chosen, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Rose, just her name in that way." "Alina Rose Keating," she said. "If that is all right." He could not speak for a moment. She did not require him to. Alina was, from the start, a force of nature in miniature. She walked at 10 months and ran at 11 and spent her second year largely in the act of escape, from rooms, from the yard, from any enclosure that did not interest her at the current moment. Louis developed what Rose privately called the Alina detection system, a constant monitoring awareness of the child's whereabouts that made him intermittently pause whatever he was doing and locate her by sound or sight before continuing. Rose found this so endearing that it sometimes made it difficult to keep a neutral expression. James taught Alina about the horses. It took longer than anticipated because Alina had opinions about everything and felt that the established method of introduction was too slow. But by the time she was 3, she could walk the older mare on a lead rope with competence, and the look on James's face when she did it correctly for the first time was everything. Emmett Burgess retired in 1883 after developing a persistent stiffness in his knees that made the heavy work impractical. He moved to Pueblo to live near his railroad daughter, and at the small farewell supper they gave him in the kitchen, he told Louis that this was the best farm he had worked, and that Louis was the best man he had worked for, and that he had thoroughly enjoyed watching what had happened between Louis and Rose because he had seen it coming before either of them had admitted it to themselves. "I knew from the day you came back from her place in January," he told Louis, "and you came in with that look on your face and went straight out to split wood even though we had enough for 2 weeks. Louis said, "I was cold." "You were not cold," Emmett said. "It was 50 degrees and sunny." Rose laughed. James and Alina, both of whom were too young to understand the full substance of what was being said, laughed anyway because their mother was laughing. They hired a young man named Cord Rivera to take Emmett's place, a 20-year-old from a Mexican family that had been in the territory for 3 generations, well before the American migration, who knew the land with a depth that came from actual heritage rather than acquired knowledge. Louis paid him properly and consulted his expertise genuinely, and Rose treated him as the skilled professional he was, which she knew was not always what workers received, and which she was acutely aware of given the ways the territory's history of injustice toward the families who had been there first pressed constantly against the lives of men like Cord. He stayed with them for 7 years, and they treated him well, and the farm was better for his presence in every measurable way. By 1885, the farm had expanded to 120 acres, most of it under productive use, and the Keating name was associated in the La Veta territory with quality beef and good wheat and fair dealing. Rose had established a kitchen garden of a scale that now produced enough preserved goods each fall to sell some at the La Veta market, and she kept the accounts of the household with a clarity and precision that made the yearly reckoning with the bank an exercise in confidence rather than anxiety. They were not wealthy by the standards of eastern cities, or even by the standards of the Colorado ranching operations that had the backing of large capital. But they were solvent and growing, and they owned their land outright, and they owed nothing to anyone. And on an evening in the fall of 1885, when the aspen on the hillsides above the property had gone full gold and the harvest was in, and the cattle were fat, Rose stood on the porch of the cabin that she and Louis had expanded twice since they married, and she looked at what they had made together, and felt a feeling that she could only describe as profound. Louis came and stood beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking about January of 1878, she said, "when I walked to your place in Thomas's coat in the cold and knocked on your door." "What about it?" "I am thinking that I had no idea what I was walking toward. I thought I was walking toward help with a body and a burial. I did not know I was walking toward this." He looked at the mountains, which had their first snow on the high peaks already, and the aspens, and the cattle in the south pasture, and the barn that they had rebuilt and expanded 2 years ago and that was considerably better than the original, and the garden beds already put to sleep for winter, and the smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, and James sitting on the fence post of the corral doing something that looked like whittling, and Aliner's voice audible from inside the house engaged in some project that was almost certainly going to make a significant mess. "We walked toward each other," he said. She leaned into him. "Louis," she said, "Rose, are you happy?" He was quiet for a moment in the considering way, not because he did not know, but because he was Louis Keating and he took statements seriously. "More than I have ever been," he said. "More than I believed was available to me when I came to this territory. More than I had a right to expect." "You had every right to it," she said firmly. "You are a good man." "I had a good teacher," he said. She looked up at him. "I did not teach you anything. You taught me what it looked like to fight for something without letting the fighting make you hard. You taught me the difference between pride and dignity. You taught me that a person can love again after they have been broken, and that the second love does not have to be lesser than what came before. It can be entirely different and entirely itself." She felt the familiar sting behind her eyes that she no longer tried to prevent. "That is a great deal of philosophy for a man who claimed he was just going for a walk at 4 in the morning," she said. He smiled then, a real smile, the kind she had worked to earn and had never gotten tired of receiving. "I was going for a walk," he said. "Your barn happened to be on the way." She laughed, and he kissed the top of her head, and inside the house Aliner erupted with the particular sound of a child who had either achieved something magnificent or created a serious problem, and they would not know which until they went in. James called from the fence, "Mama, I think Ellie knocked over the flower." "I did not." Aliner's voice came immediately and indignantly from inside, with the specific energy of someone who absolutely had. Rose and Louis looked at each other. "It was on the way," she said. "It was," he agreed, and they went inside together. The spring of 1887 brought 2 things. The first was a letter from Rose's mother in Kentucky, who had been widowed the previous year and who asked, in the carefully composed way of mothers asking things they were afraid to ask directly, whether there might be room for a visit. Rose wrote back that same evening and said there was room for more than a visit, that there was room for a permanent arrangement if her mother wanted it, and that the territory, while different from Kentucky in every way, had proven itself capable of sustaining the kind of life a person could build on. Louis had not been consulted before she wrote the letter. When she told him what she had done, he looked at her for a moment and then said, "Good, just that." And she loved him specifically and precisely for that one word in that moment, because it contained no qualification and no territorial reservation and no polite calculation of inconvenience. Just good. Her mother, Helen Waverly Daggett, arrived in June on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad to La Veta, which had a proper station by 1887, And she was a small, bright-eyed woman of 58 who looked at Louis Keating the way women who had spent their lives reading men looked at him, thoroughly and without hurry, and then told Rose privately that evening that she had clearly done something right. "He watches you," Helen said, while Louis was putting the horses away and James and Alina were both audibly in disagreement about something in the next room. "He does," Rose said. "Not the way men watch things they own," Helen said. "The other way." "Yes," Rose said. Helen stayed. The cabin, expanded twice, accommodated her without difficulty, and she found a function within the household that was useful rather than decorative, taking over much of the kitchen work that freed Rose for the outdoor operations she had always preferred, and developing a relationship with James and Alina that was exactly what grandmothers were supposed to be. Alina, who had no tolerance for being managed, had found in Helen someone who did not try to manage her, but instead pointed her at projects of such interesting complexity that she managed herself in the process of completing them. By the time Alina was 7, she could read anything put in front of her, had an extensive knowledge of plants and their uses from Helen's Kentucky herb traditions, and was conducting what she described as experiments on the vegetable garden that had so far produced results that were mostly positive. James, at 8, was spending increasing time with Cord Rivera, learning the cattle work with an absorption that made it clear that this was his natural inclination. Cord was a patient teacher and James a serious student, and Louis watched this with the specific satisfaction of a man seeing his son develop into someone whole. In 1889, Colorado had been a state for 13 years, and the territory was shifting and changing in ways both good and complicated. The railroad had brought connection, but also the particular pressures that connection brought, the standardizing force of an outside world that did not always look at the high country with understanding. Rose and Louis were aware of these pressures, but insulated from the worst of them by the solidity of what they had built and the relative independence of a farm that produced what it needed. They made a trip together to Denver in the fall of 1889, the first time either of them had been to a real city in years, leaving James and Alina in the capable care of Helen and Cord. The occasion was Louis's testimony at a water rights hearing that had county-wide implications, growing out of the cooperative water arrangement he had established with the Carver family and others nearly a decade before. His careful documentation and fair-minded approach had apparently made him something of a reference for the region on the subject, and the county asked him to speak. He was nervous, in the quiet interior way that he was nervous about things, which Rose detected by the particular quality of his silence on the train from La Veta to Pueblo, and then north to Denver. She sat beside him and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand palm up and held hers. "You know more about this than anyone who will be in that room," she said. "Knowing and speaking are different things." "Not for you," she said. "When you have something true to say, you say it clearly. I have seen you do it." He looked out the train window at the planes going past. "That is different. That is 2 farmers with a creek between them. The principle is the same. Water rights are water rights and fairness is fairness, and you understand both." He pressed her hand. He did speak at the hearing, and he was clear and specific and thoroughly prepared, and the panel listened with attention, and 2 of the frameworks he proposed were eventually adopted at the county level. The Denver newspaper ran a brief notice about the hearing and mentioned a Huafano County farmer named Louis Keating, and Rose cut it out and kept it in the household ledger between the pages of the year's accounts. They had a night in Denver, in a hotel that was the most comfortable accommodation either of them had experienced since coming west, and they had supper at a proper restaurant, and Rose wore the blue silk dress from their wedding, which still fit because she was built lean and strong, and Louis wore the same suit, which also still fit, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight of the restaurant with all of it around them, the city sounds and the china and the crystal and the white tablecloths. And Louis looked at her and said, "I would rather be on our porch." "So would I," she said, but this is very good soup." They walked back to the hotel through the October evening, and the city was lit and busy and full of the noise of a place with ambitions. And she took his arm and leaned against him and thought about the porch they would rather be on, with the mountains going dark in the west and the aspens finished with their gold for the year and the cattle settled for the night and the smell of wood smoke from the chimney they had rebuilt with better stone the previous summer. "Louis," she said. "Rose, I want to tell you something true." He looked down at her as they walked. The light from a storefront made his eyes that impossible spring water color. "Tell me," he said. "The morning I found the barn mucked," she said. "The April morning in 1878, I was lying in bed and I knew it was you before I even got up, and I was afraid. I was afraid of what it meant. I was afraid of opening up to anything again." "I know," he said. "And when I went to your place to confront you about it, I had planned to be very clear and contained about the whole thing." "You were," he said, "relatively. I told myself on the walk back from your place that it was just coffee between neighbors and that it meant nothing. I know that too. I was wrong about all of it," she said. "I was wrong about being afraid and wrong about being contained and very wrong about it meaning nothing. I just wanted you to know that I know that it was the right crack in the right wall at the right time, and I am grateful for it every day." He stopped walking. They were on a Denver sidewalk with people moving around them, the October night cool and full of lamplight, and he took both her hands in his and looked at her with the full contained force of everything he was. "Rose Dalton Keating," he said. "Yes. I walked 2 miles in the dark to muck a barn because I could not sleep, and I could not stop thinking about a woman who was managing more than anyone should have to manage alone, and because doing something useful in her direction was the only thing available to me that felt like any kind of relief." He squeezed her hands. "I was not entirely honest with you about that at the time. I said I was going for a walk. You were working up to telling me," she said, with a slight smile. "I was. And now I am telling you. It was not accidental. Nothing about coming toward you has ever been accidental. Every step of it has been the most deliberate thing I have ever done." She looked at him in the Denver lamplight, this quiet man from Missouri with the gray eyes and the deliberate hands and the extraordinary patience, who had walked 2 miles in the dark because he could not stop thinking about her, who had waited and tended and built a life with her that was larger than either of them had made alone. "Take me home," she said. He did. Not that night, because the train back was the following morning, and they had a hotel room with a very comfortable bed that would have been wasteful to ignore. But the next day, on the train south and then west into the mountains, they went home. James was 12 in 1891 and had decided, with the clarity that certain children brought to their vocations, that he was going to be a cattle man. Not a farmer who also kept cattle, but a man whose primary enterprise was beef, whose knowledge and whose judgment about animals and land and weather was his capital. He had been keeping a notebook for 2 years about the herd, noting individual animals' characteristics, tracking weights and health, observing behaviors that no one had asked him to observe. Louis found the notebook one evening by accident and stood reading it for 20 minutes without sitting down. He brought it to Rose. "Read this," he said. She read it. It was, for a 12-year-old, extraordinary. It was for a 35-year-old who had spent his adult life working cattle. "He is going to be better at this than either of us," she said. "Yes," Louis said. There was no competition in it, no deflation, just the pure satisfaction of it. Alina at 9 was reading everything in the house and running out of material at a speed that alarmed Helen and delighted Rose, who began making special trips to Lavetta's lending library and writing to Denver for books through the mail. Alina's particular fascinations were plants, weather patterns, and anything to do with how things worked at the mechanical level. She had disassembled the kitchen clock, studied it for 2 days, and reassembled it in working order, which Louis had watched through the kitchen doorway with an expression that suggested this was the single most interesting thing he had ever witnessed. "She is going to need more schooling than Lavetta can offer," Rose said. "I know," Louis said. There are women's academies now in Denver and in Colorado Springs. When she is ready, he said, we will make it happen. That will cost considerably. We will set aside for it now, he said, starting this year, and they did. There was a jar in the back of the pantry behind the preserved tomatoes, which grew steadily and was counted every January, and became Alina's education. And Alina knew it existed and what it was for, and Rose watched the knowledge of it affect her daughter, the particular straightening that happened in the spine of a child who is told that their potential is considered worth saving for. The decade of the 1890s was in some ways the fullest of their lives. The farm had found its right scale, and they its right operation. James took increasing responsibility for the cattle side, working with Cord, and then, as Cord eventually moved on to his own land, with workers James identified and hired with a judgment that proved consistently sound. Alina went to the Colorado Springs Academy for Young Women in 1898 at 15, which was a year younger than usual admission, but which Alina achieved by demonstrating, through an examination, a level of preparation that the administrator admitted was the highest she had seen in a decade. The morning Alina left for Colorado Springs, on the train from La Veta, Rose held her on the platform for a long moment. Alina, who was not given to extended embraces, allowed this one. You will write, Rose said. Not when you have time, every week. Every week, Alina agreed. Louis shook her hand formally and then pulled her into a hug which made Alina's eyes go bright in a way she was clearly managing. You know what you are doing, he told her. Trust that. Yes, Papa, she said. They watched the train go. Rose slipped her hand into Louis' and they stood on the La Veta platform in the September morning and watched until the train was gone. She is going to be magnificent, Rose said. She already is, Louis said. James, at 19, had become the person his childhood notebook had promised. He was tall like Louis, quieter than most people expected from a young man, deeply competent with the cattle and increasingly respected in the valley as someone whose judgment about animals and land was worth hearing. He had a girl he was courting, the eldest daughter of the Anders family from the pharmacy, a sensible and kind young woman named Clara, which Rose found quietly interesting, though she kept this observation to herself. In 1899, the turn of the century pressed on everyone's awareness, the sense of a hinge in time. Rose was 47 and Louis was 52, and they sat on their porch on the last evening of the century as they had decided to wait up for midnight, which was something they had never done before, and the high country was cold and clear. And the stars were the same stars they had always been, and Helen was asleep inside at 87 and still sharp as a needle, and James was down at his own small house at the south end of the property that he had built with Louis and Cord the previous summer. And Alina was in Colorado Springs completing her final year, and Cord's replacement, a young man from La Veta who had grown up watching Louis Keating and wanted to farm like him, was in the bunkhouse. 52 years, Rose said. It was what Louis would be on his next birthday in February. It does not feel like 52, he said. What does it feel like? He considered. Like I'm just getting started, he said. She laughed. The cold was significant and she had her good wool shawl and he had put his arm around her shoulders in the way that had become, over 22 years, as natural as breathing. We have a son who is going to be a great cattle man, she said. And a daughter who is going to be whatever she decides to be, which I predict will be something none of us have imagined yet, and a farm that runs, and your mother's name on a daughter who has her eyes. And my mother inside asleep at an age that proves Daggett women are harder to stop than we look. What do we not have? Louis said. She thought about it. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. The stars over the mountains were extraordinary. Nothing, she said. We do not have anything we need. He kissed her temple, which was something he had always done, and which she had always filed under the category of things about him she could not account for in any practical register, but that mattered more than most practical things. Happy New Year, he said. Happy New Year, she said. Somewhere distant, probably from the direction of La Veta, there was the sound of someone celebrating, a shot fired into the air, a bell, the muffled sound of voices. Here on the porch in the high country, in the silence that was never entirely silent but was always inhabited, Rose Dalton Keating and Louis Keating sat together as the century turned and became the next one. Eleanor came home from Colorado Springs in the summer of 1900 with a diploma and a determination to study botany at the university level, which was still a complicated ambition for a woman, but which Eleanor approached with the same systematic purposefulness she had brought to the kitchen clock. She spent that summer at the farm, in the garden that was her first laboratory, cataloging plants and writing letters to academic institutions. And in the evenings she sat with Rose on the porch and talked about what the world was becoming. And Rose listened with the full force of her attention and told her daughter what she believed, which was that the world generally became what the people in it were willing to fight for. Louis sat with them sometimes, and sometimes he was in his study going over the farm accounts or reading the agricultural reports he subscribed to from the state extension. And those evenings Eleanor would look toward the window where the lamplight showed and say, "Papa is reading again." "He is always reading," Rose said. "He is the best farmer in this valley because he never stopped learning," Eleanor said. "Yes," Rose said. "I intend to be like that," Eleanor said. "You already are," Rose told her. James married Clara Anders in October of 1900. The wedding was at the La Veta Methodist Church, the same church where Louis and Rose had married 22 years before, and it seated the same quantity of people with the same overflow, because the Keating name by 1900 had accumulated a weight of community that filled rooms. Rose sat in the front pew in a dark green wool dress she had made herself, and Louis sat beside her in the suit that no longer quite fit the same way as 22 years ago, but that he wore because it was the suit. And she put her hand over his during the ceremony, and he turned his palm up and held hers. Afterward, at the supper in the church hall, Harlan Booth, who was 70 and still writing for the Star and still constitutionally incapable of minding his own business, came and told them it was a wonderful occasion, and that the Keating family was one of the valley's great examples, and Rose thanked him with perfect civility, and did not mention that he had once told her that a man whose wife left him had usually given her a reason. Louis noticed the civility. On the walk home, he said, "You were very gracious to Booth." "I am always gracious," she said. "You were particularly gracious to Booth." She looked at him sideways. "He is old. He was meddlesome when he was young." "Yes," she said, "but he did not break anything permanently." Louis took her hand. "No," he said, "nothing was broken permanently." In 1902, James and Clara had their first child, a boy they named William Louis Keating, and Rose became, at 50, a grandmother, which was a thing she looked at from several directions before deciding that it was, in fact, exactly what she felt. Helen, who was 90 by then and in her last year of sharp-minded life, held William Louis and said that the circle was a comfort. Helen died in the spring of 1903, quietly in her bed in the room that had been hers for 16 years, in the presence of Rose and with Louis holding Rose's hand. She had been the kind of mother who improved with age, and her going was both peaceful and genuinely mourned. Louis held Rose through the days that followed, and let her be sad without trying to address it, and when she cried he was present without trying to stop it. And when she was ready to talk, he was there for that too. And when she was ready to work, he helped her work. And all of it was the language of love that she had learned to speak with him, and that required no translation. The farm moved into its third decade of their stewardship. Eleanor had gone to the University of Colorado in Boulder, one of the first women in the botany program, and was conducting research on high-altitude plant species that was being noticed in academic circles. She came home twice a year and wrote every week as promised, and the letters were full of the particular Eleanor vitality that made reading them feel like standing in a wind. James had become, as they had always believed he would, the cattle man he was meant to be. The herd under his management was among the finest in Huafano County, and he had developed a reputation for breed quality that brought buyers from as far as Denver and once from Kansas City. Cord Rivera, who had settled his own farm in the valley, remained a close friend and occasional collaborator, and the relationship between the Rivera family and the Keating family was one of mutual respect and real affection. In the autumn of 1905, Rose and Louis were both sitting on the porch as they did on every evening that the weather allowed, which was their daily practice and had been for 27 years. The aspens were gold again on the hillsides above the cabin that had been expanded and improved, and which was now substantially larger than the original structure, but that still had the same placement, the same orientation toward the mountains, the same porch with the same view. Rose was 53. Louis was 58. Neither of them felt the way they had heard that people those ages should feel, which they attributed to the outdoor life, and to the fact that work that is meaningful keeps the spirit young even when the body reminded you, on cold mornings and the mornings after hard days, that it was keeping account. "I have been thinking about something," Rose said. "Tell me." "I have been thinking about the morning I found the barn done, before I went to your place. I was lying in bed in the dark and I was afraid, and part of what I was afraid of was," she paused, finding the exact word. "I was afraid of being seen, being known. After Thomas, I had pulled into myself so completely that the idea of someone seeing into that and knowing what was there, all the grief and the fear and the stubbornness and the need, felt like the most exposed thing I could imagine." Louis was quiet, listening. "And then I went to your place and you were splitting wood and you waited for me with your full attention and I felt seen, before I said a word. And I was terrified and I also, underneath the terror, felt something that I could only call relief. Like I had been holding my breath for a very long time." She looked at him. "You saw me from the beginning, from that first morning when I came to your door in Thomas's coat. You saw everything and you did not try to fix it or diminish it or manage it. You saw it." He was looking at her in the old way, the spring water way. "Rose," he said, "I want you to know that is the thing I am most grateful for, more than the fence and the garden and the barn, the being seen." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat in the golden October afternoon, the mountains to the west already carrying their permanent snow now for the season, the cattle moving in the south pasture, James's house visible at the far end of the property, smoke rising from its chimney. "I have seen you from the first day," Louis said. "I have never stopped. And every year there is more to see," he stopped. "Which is the most extraordinary thing I know." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He pressed his face against her hair. "I love you, Louis Keating," she said. "I love you, Rose Dalton," he said. He always said it that way. Her name, her original name, the name she had arrived in the world with and brought to everything that came after. It was the most intimate thing he did, and she had never asked him why he did it because she already knew. It was how he said that she was herself, entirely herself, before and beyond and underneath everything else. It was how he said he had known her and chosen her as the specific person she was. The sun went lower, and the shadows stretched long across the yard, and the aspens flickered gold on the hillside, and the air carried the particular clarity of a high-country October. And they sat together in the good quiet that was one of the things they had made, one of the invisible constructions of a life built together, as solid and real as the cabin at their backs and the land at their feet and the family that moved through it all. And as the evening came on and the stars began their extraordinary Colorado appearance, one by one and then all at once, Louis Keating and Rose Dalton sat on their porch and held hands and were home.